All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Iconocast here with the Southeastern Louisiana University English Department Colloquium Group. My name is Tyler. This is Alec. Today's guest is Dr. Pete Enns, a very unique guest for us, and we're very excited for him. He is a biblical scholar and theologian whose work me and Alec and a few other graduate students have come along in the last 6 months or long. Some of our journeys have been longer. His readings of the Bible are very interesting. Apply many of the skills we learned here in the department in a very unique field. Some of his works include The Bible Tells Me So, Why Defending Scripture Has Made Us Unable to Read It, and Inspiration and Incarnation. Without any further ado, let's welcome Dr. Pete Enns. How you doing, Mr. Pete Enns?
I'm doing great. You guys sound like you're doing great too.
We're doing good.
Everybody's doing great.
Yeah, you're in Pennsylvania, or where are you at?
We should just stop now because everybody's doing great. That's what I look at it.
That's right.
Yeah, I'm in southeastern Pennsylvania. North of Philadelphia, about maybe a half hour, 45 minutes. So
good. Y'all have good weather right now?
Today, well, it's getting better. It's a bit cool today. It's in the 50s. So that's cool. But it's supposed to be 85 on Wednesday. So I'm totally down with that. So
well, we're in spring right now, but we'll get rolling. Real quick, a disclaimer for all the listeners out there. We just want to say that we're going to follow the Bible literary tradition, but it is the Bible, and I'm just an inquisitive layman. Alec here, my graduate peer, came from St. Joseph Seminary School over in Covington, so he's got a little bit going on. Cool. So we might fall down a few rabbit holes on the content. We invite it, and we look forward to it, but we're just going to let Dr. Pete Enns take us wherever he might want to take us. All right.
All right. Well, let's see what happens here.
So. All right,
Dr. Enns, can you give us a little bit of a biography of you, like your personal and academic journey?
Sure. Yeah. Well, it's sort of relevant to say my parents were immigrants from Germany. So I grew up in a home that didn't speak English for a few years. It was all German. And they sort of had my sister and I go to church a little bit when we were younger. In other words, I wasn't raised in a conservative home, like a lot of people were raised in like a fundamentalist or evangelical home. I wasn't raised like that. But I sort of came to personal faith when I was in high school. It just sort of happened. And that eventually drove me to, I really wanted to understand this faith that I said I had. I mean, some people are just wired like that. And that eventually drove me to seminary, where I studied for 4 years, and then graduate school after that, where I have a PhD after 5 years of study. And it's just a constant source of exploration and curiosity for me. I love the Bible. It's a very weird book, and it's not one you always want to take literally, but it's a beautiful book that's also very challenging because it's so ancient and it's so far removed from our frame of reference. And I just really enjoy digging into it and trying to understand it as best as I can.
Cool.
All right, very good. In our previous colloquiums, we talk about this tension that kind of happens with literature and an orally centered culture. So a culture predating literacy or maintaining orality until literacy replaced it. Yeah. How does the oral literature relationship exist in the Bible?
Well, it does. It's all very theoretical, but it's sort of assumed by biblical scholars that the earliest, versions of the Bible, so to speak, were not written, but were passed down orally. And that oral tradition resulted in a lot of just changes, a lot of adaptations to the oral, to oral precursors, because that's what people do. They tell stories and they tell them differently depending on the context and depending on just the situation. And, some of us like to think that it sort of ruined it when these things got written down, because now they don't have a life of their own anymore. And now you're sort of stuck to like a legal text almost, like here it is and what do you do with these words? Whereas, the orality of it is, it allows for a certain kind of freedom and adaptability, which I think is very important. But see, here's the irony, the Bible itself, and let's stick to what Christians call the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. There is so much diversity in these texts. It is not an easy book to wrap your head around, or collection of books rather. And the reason why there's diversity is because these writings were written at different times in different places by different people under different circumstances. There is already a flexibility built into the written record because it reflects all this diversity. So I think that actually the Bible does a pretty good job of maintaining some of that oral vibe, that things change. And so at some point in time in history, Jewish scribes, they brought these writings together under sort of one cover, and we call it the Bible. But within it, we really have a lot of just beautiful diversity and contradictions, and people struggling with faith, and people disagreeing with each other, even within the pages of the Bible. And I think that makes it a very beautiful thing. And I think that's consistent with the oral beginnings of it.
Oh, cool. With that understanding, and I guess we can float around the Old Testament. How do you navigate exegesis and eisegesis with that understanding of orality,
Yes, yeah.
literacy? How do you navigate that?
It's a very good question. I think that it's hard to escape doing both of those at the same time. There is really no such thing as pure exegesis, getting the meaning from the text, because the biblical texts are quite ambiguous. And they're also removed from us by, in some cases, as much as maybe 2,500 years, even 3,000 years or more, from a different culture. So and plus, the thought that there's like an objective meaning lurking in a text that we just have to sort of draw out by paying attention to the words is actually a little bit naive in terms of literature. So, we're always engaging this text. When I say we, I mean people of faith who look to the Bible to help them navigate their reality, right? We're always bringing a bit of ourselves into that interpretive process. And I think that's inescapable. I think we see it within the pages of the Bible itself, people doing that. I mean, a really good example is just to throw the New Testament into this. The New Testament writers are forever engaging their Bible, which is what Christians call the Old Testament. And they're always doing it in ways that are clearly driven, not by extracting from the text its meaning, let's say the meaning that an author put there, but they're really driven by engaging those texts for the benefit of the questions they're asking at their present moment. And so that's already eisegesis. You have a sense, a true sense in which your questions and your context not only affect the way you read a text, but they affect the assumptions you make about a text. They affect the very questions you bring to the text. And I mean, personally, I don't find that to be a problem. I find that to be an inevitability. And actually, it's one of the things that keeps the Bible going, right? If it was just a matter of extracting information from the past, we don't live in the past. The past is not really relevant for us. It has to have this built-in flexibility, eisegesis, that allows us to keep moving this text forward in history that can still engage people literally 2-3 millennia after the things were written down, which is pretty astounding.
Yeah. That's we were talking about the eisegesis within the Bible. We didn't even frame it that way, but the working within the tradition between New Testament, Old Testament, which we know you speak a lot of and write a lot of. About.
See, it's also like, because of now illiterate culture, like that is, you say that it's inevitable. So it, like, now that the text is inevitable, like the New Testament writers would have been engaging with that Old Testament and writing it, their works down.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
But there's a thing that, and with the Bible, it's challenging because the role that the Bible plays for so many people,
right.
Which is something that is the big question that you ask, what that role should be. When we interpret text that is not biblical, other literature, we have to sometimes walk the boundaries of what is called affective fallacy, which is us putting a meaning upon it, and the intentional fallacy. Do not enforce even really the writer's intention 100%, because of sociological, cultural things. And if you
Right.
put God into the mix for so
Yes.
many people, when you're interpreting, what do you use to distinguish the meaning of the text, the books, the scriptures?
Yeah, I think that's a perennial question that you're asking. It comes up all the time. And the thing is that I wish I had a formula, but I don't. It's because again, I think actually it's because we're dealing with a text of spiritual importance where it's a means of communing with the creator, right? That's really how the Bible is used. I think it's for that very reason that invites more of the flexibility because even the writers of scripture were not omniscient, and they were limited in their understandings of a whole lot of things, just like everybody is. And the God factor that comes into that, I think, is that diverse collection of texts is a sufficient means by which people can commune with God, albeit with wrestling with the text as well, not simply just learning what it said back then, but engaging it in our own context. So I'm not sure if that, Tyler, if that hits at your question. It's a really good one. It's a complicated one, to ferret out what an author intended, which I have to tell you is impossible. Like, I can't figure, I have to be careful. My wife's in the next room. I can't figure her out. I've been married to her for like 30 something years, right? So, and the intentional thing is very difficult. And now we're removed again, centuries upon centuries upon centuries.
Right.
And the way biblical scholars discern an author's intention is by reading the words in front of them. And they start theorizing as to what the author's intention might have been. And sometimes we can draw some pretty good conclusions as biblical scholars, I think. But the thing is, the circular notion here is that we're discerning the author's intention on the basis of the text. And then we go and interpret the text on the basis of the authorial intention we just reconstructed, right?
Yeah.
It's inevitably circular, and there's no anchor point to put down and say, now I know exactly what the author's saying. I think the more we know about history and the more we know about the context of some of these writings, for example, I may not know, just picking a text, second Isaiah, if that opens up a can of worms, I don't know. But I can say with some confidence, for a number of reasons, second Isaiah was written after the exile began. And it's helpful to know that. It's actually helpful to know the general context, but that doesn't give us access to an author's intention. And plus, people talk about, an analogy is a Shakespearean corpus, for example. People get meanings out of Shakespeare that Shakespeare never intended, right? Are they good meanings? Yeah, probably.
Yeah.
So a meaning of a text isn't even limited by an author's intention.
Right.
It's something we can't get, and even if we have it, these words take on a life of their own, especially if they're religious literature. They
Right.
have to take on a life of their own. They can't just stay in the past.
Yeah. And that I know in your writing, in your talks, you talk about how you trekked through the Jewish tradition.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Present, past Jews, the way that they engage the text, the way that they dialogue about it. Can you explain a little bit of that to our viewers about what that might mean to those of us who are ignorant to it?
Yeah, sure. And I think just, it's a little bit sort of a little simplistic the way I put it sometimes, but it still works. Sort of comparing and contrasting Jewish ways of engaging the Bible and standard Christian ways of engaging the Bible, at least in modern Christianity. Judaism has tended to be, if there are any Jews listening, you're probably saying it's more complicated than this. I know it, but let me just say it this way. Judaism has tended to be more comfortable with wrestling with the text and the responsibility of actually interrogating the text and arguing with it. the history of the Christian faith has been a little bit different because, well, as one of my Jewish professors, John Levinson, puts it, he says, for Jews, the Bible is a problem to be solved. You get to argue and debate it. For Christians, it's a message to be proclaimed, which means you can't have room for ambiguity in that kind of a way of thinking. It's got to be the message you nail down. This is what it means. And that's largely the legacy of the Protestant Reformation. A text has one meaning, and you've got to find it. And if you don't see it, well, God will reveal it to you. Of course, he reveals it differently to all these different denominations. They disagree about stuff. But, but the Jewish way is more, is really helpful to me. I mean, spiritually, it's been very helpful to me and continues to be, where I get to sort of look at the text and say, wait a minute. That's completely contradicts what I read 4 chapters earlier, or even a few verses earlier. But see, that is the very invitation. Again, I'm sort of channeling Jewish thinking that I've heard on this, but that very tension in the text is the engagement, is the invitation to engage with the Spirit of God. That kind of debating with the text is actually a form of worship, not heresy, right? And to me, it's a very, very liberating thing to realize that, listen, I'm not going to nail this book down in the next hour or two. People have been thinking about this for a long time, very different opinions on the text. Diachronic and synchronic diversity in biblical interpretation throughout time and at this very moment across the world. Like, there's something happening in this text that refuses to be simply brought under one umbrella, right? And I think that's the reality that we deal with. And I think it's actually a beautiful reality. And Jewish approaches to interpretation, I think, are just more organically open to that kind of a discussion. And for Christians, I think it's a matter of learning that language again, because there was a time in our history when we had that language. We could handle diverse meanings. In the medieval period, fourfold meaning of Scripture. Scripture doesn't mean one thing. It has a literal meaning, but that's the most boring. The other ones are so much more interesting, right?
Right.
And Paul, who wrote so much of the New Testament, is not a modernist. He's an ancient Jew, and talk about a flexible approach to the text where, it means something for Paul that really has no bearing whatsoever and what it meant for the original writers of the Old Testament.
Yeah. Wow. That's awesome. Yeah.
Yeah. We talked about how the Bible works within itself, quoting and comparing, and that's like the sign of a literary engagement. This product of a literate culture, or in Judeo-Christian especially, do you see that people overextend or misrepresent this engagement?
Say that again, Al. Rephrase that a little bit for me, if you wouldn't mind.
So the Bible works within itself, quoting and comparing,
right?
And we see that as a literary engagement, like the New Testament writers,
right,
engaging the Old Testament.
Yeah.
Do you see that people overextend or misrepresent this like connection between books? Or?
Well, I think I think they do. Sometimes they underrepresent it. Sometimes they overrepresent it. Meaning, if you don't see that kind of engagement within the books, you're going to miss that very Jewish thing that we're talking about, right? If you represent it, then what comes up very often is, and we see this, just watch any TV preacher that you can see, it can mean anything I want it to mean that will serve my own ends, right? And I think that's something that both Judaism and Christianity, at least in its best expressions, has avoided. It's not about what I want it to mean just haphazardly. It's about what's good for the community. It's what's good for the building of the faith. But it's not about just simply, getting, again, the author's meaning. But neither is it whatever I want it to mean, it can mean. There's got to be something in the middle there. Augustine said, basically, whatever promotes love is the right engagement of the text. And I think that's not a bad way to start thinking about it. It doesn't solve everything, because what is love? But it introduces the ethical dimension of engaging Scripture, which is very, very important. And if you're engaging Scripture and making Proverbs say something about your own personal wealth that it doesn't say, I don't think we're engaging scripture ethically at that point. And ethics has to do, I'm speaking for Christians now, ethics has to do not just with within your tribe and not even within the Christian faith, but I think for the world as a whole. And that includes humans and animals and plants and trees and the air that we breathe and everything else.
Yeah.
Yeah. How do you think, like talking about this engagement with the New Testament writers and the Old Testament writers, for example, how also does the Bible engage with cultures outside of itself?
How can it not do that, right? Because it's and the thing is, it's not just engagement, but it's simply breathing the air of the cultures and contexts that they're in. And that's always fascinating to me, whether it's, the creation stories that, clearly mimic ancient Near Eastern mythological texts, the flood story as well. When you have views of God as a warrior, as a militaristic leader, that makes perfect sense in an ancient tribal context. I don't have a problem with that. I don't think God is like that. I think God is different, but I think that's part of the tradition, right? So, the New Testament, the Gospels, follow a particular genre of Greco-Roman literature called the Bios, B-I-O-S, which is not really a biography, but it's a way of telling the story of important people. Paul's letters follow the context and the rhythms of Roman ways of communicating. There isn't a syllable of the Bible that escapes cultural influence. And I think for the Christian faith, let me just speak for Christianity, for the Christian faith, that should never be a problem, because we have this mystery of the incarnation that pops up in our faith, which nobody understands, including myself. And I'm not going to try to ferret out, what does that mean? I don't care. But it's the God not keeping God's distance from the human predicament, from the human drama. And, our Bible shows that, right? And through, it is thoroughly and completely a part of the cultures that produced it. And I think the trick for Christians, or at least for some, is to make that a theological positive rather than a problem that you have to solve.
Yeah. With the diversity of cultural influences, there's also, you alluded to this, and a few of your writings, it blew our mind about the diversity of genres within the Bible. That's taken for granted on one level, but to understand how you can distinguish meaning through genre, like you do.
Right.
Can you explain how you work through that? How do you distinguish the genre? Is there any? Are you using prior interpretations, prior understandings? Are there clues in the work? How do you do that?
Yeah, that's again a very that's a key question on a key issue, because what I've heard others say, and I agree with this, is that biblical interpretation, good biblical interpretation, is largely a matter of proper genre identification. What are you reading, right? Now, again, the thing is that these texts don't come with labels, right? And we have to sort of try to discern what the possible genre is, I think, from two different angles. What we're reading in the text, and then can we situate this in its ancient context more broadly by looking at the literature of other cultures, right? So a really good example here is, the creation stories. I say two because Genesis 1 and 2 and 3 are two very different kinds of ways of talking about beginnings. But, we have a really good handle today on not treating those things as history the way we understand history, but as treating them as mythological, theological treatises on a whole host of possible issues. And we say that with more confidence today than maybe we did 500 years ago, because we found a lot of stuff in the ancient world that tells stories in a very similar way. And we look at all those together and they say, well, this is how ancient people told stories about origins, about beginnings. So I think of, what they call extra biblical literature, which is sort of biasing the Bible a little bit there, but, just writing from antiquity outside of the Bible. That helps us with genre calibration. We can calibrate the genre of these texts. In other words, it's the stuff outside of the Bible that now we look at the Bible itself and say, it doesn't look like they're writing history in any way that we understand that word history. They're saying something of deep meaning using symbols, basically, or using metaphors of some sort, or characters represent not this themselves, but they represent a whole people. Like, one of my big things is the Adam and Eve story. Adam actually represents Israel as a whole in that story. And we come to those kinds of theories about interpretation because of the genre question. We don't interpret Psalms as giving us commands, because these are people pouring out their hearts to God, whether for good or for ill. Things are going great, things are not going well. So we read those differently than we might read, the book of Genesis, for example. So genre is very important, and genre identification, in a manner of speaking, you could summarize the entire history of biblical scholarship largely under that category. What are we reading and what do we make of it?
Nice. All right, we have a student question that came in, Dr. Enns.
Okay.
So this might take us off somewhere, but let's see what Kendall's got for us.
Who cares?
Yeah.
It all goes together anyway. So
Yeah.
All right. So this question comes from Lindsay, and she is asking, do you know of any books that talk about the interaction between Greco-Roman mythology and Judeo-Christianity in regards to creationism and the flood?
Oh, no, boy, if there's a book like that, there might be, I just don't know. But that would be a really interesting kind of matrix of issues there to sort of come together. I think sometimes we underestimate ancient people, that we sort of assume they think they're writing history. So, with creation, I sort of joke with my students, the Adam and Eve story. The story of Adam and Eve is God making sure nobody takes it seriously, because you've got a talking snake and you've got two magic trees in the middle of a garden. So my thinking is that the ancient biblical writers already knew. Well, they didn't know. They were intending to write something of very deep importance using symbols that everyone understood. They weren't trying to write history. But bringing all those things together and then throwing the Greco-Roman world into this as well, that's another big issue, because they have their own stories, right? They have their own national mythologies. And so I wish I could answer that question and give you a real solid reference, but I don't have it. I'm sorry.
Okay. Yeah.
But when you find it, you can pass it on to these guys, and they'll pass it on to
Oh, wonderful. Yeah. We'll Lindsay, make sure to do that. All right.
Yeah, please, Lindsay.
Yeah.
By tomorrow.
By tomorrow. So this ancientness that you're talking about, and it's interesting that you say Paul is an ancient Jew as well. What is the spectrum of ancientness here? Is there a difference? Is it Old and New Testament, or are they more connected? And I guess ancientness, is that a way of thinking, like a primitive way, or is that a time? What does that mean to you, ancientness?
Yeah, I mean, primitive is not a good word. I don't like to use it, and I don't believe it. But the thing is that we do know more today, right, than people living, say, 2,000 years ago, or for that matter, 200 years ago. And maybe we're spoiled because of the explosion of knowledge that we have a handle on and we have access to. But so ancient doesn't mean backwards or primitive. It just means they're living in a different time and place where they conceived of the world differently. Part of, I would say, it's part of the evolution of civilization, not biological evolution, but just cultural evolution, that the ancient Jews wrote in certain ways about God. And that's why I don't look at, sometimes the way God is portrayed in the Bible is really, it's like, why would anybody want anything to do with this God? A little bit vindictive, really short fuse, you know, and people are dying, they're dropping like flies. You know, you got the flood story, this chapter 6 of the Bible, and everybody dies, right? It's like that's like the only solution to whatever problem is going on there. And the thing is that I look at that and I say, I don't say to myself so much, they're wrong. I say to myself, I understand culturally, pretty much, at least I think I do, why these stories would have meaning back then. But we're not part of that time today. And we always have to take the responsibility on ourselves to think about what is God like today, and to do that with some humility, and not to use that as ways of holding things over other people, right? It's just a question that we ask because we have our own hangups we're not even aware of. I mean, who knows if we don't blow ourselves up, you know, what's going to happen in the next 3,000-4,000 years, and people look back at people like me and say, "What a moron!" Like, no, I'm not a moron. Please, I'm just dealing with my stuff in the world that I live in. That's all I'm doing, and I'd like to think that God is actually bigger than all of our cultural limitations, and we're just doing the best that we can. And it takes the pressure off from having to be right about ultimate reality.
All right, Dr. Enns, what are your views on the history of the canonization of like the canonized Bible as it stands today? Is there some historicity to these works, or some interpretive homogeneity that maintains the connection?
Yeah, the canon is another, you guys are asking great questions. The canon, which is the authoritative collection of books, right? And exactly how and when it happened is somewhat of a mystery, especially for the Old Testament. Okay, here's the thing. The Dead Sea Scrolls, okay, let's say roughly 200 years before the time of Christ. At that point, there was no single authoritative collection of texts, because there are texts there that aren't never made it into the Bible, you know, and there are other texts that did, but they have two versions of Jeremiah that are different. They're just different versions, and they're fine. They're both whatever, you know. They weren't trying to nail down the one sort of version of Jeremiah, and that tells me that, you know, that's about as far back in time as we can go, like historically, scientifically. Before that, we really don't have anything to go on. So the furthest back we go, there's tremendous canonical diversity. And the diversity was streamlined in both Judaism and Christianity over the process over the next 200 to 300 years, roughly. And in the case of Christianity, probably another couple hundred years after that, out of certain needs to perpetuate their own faith traditions, that we can't just have anything go. We need to have books that we feel are consistent with the tradition itself. And that got really political really fast, you know, and that's unfortunate, but that's the way that it is. Again, problems with the written text, you have these kinds of discussions. You can control written medium, you can't control oral medium. So yeah, I think the reasons they were put together were both, you know, thoughtful, sometimes not so thoughtful, more just, again, the result of some heated debates and people calling each other names and things like that. And I think the reasons why, I mean, sticking with the Old Testament again, you know, there were reasons given, like, you know, if you have a text that's written by a Jew, obviously, but written in Greek, it doesn't make the cut, because this has to be in Hebrew or maybe Aramaic, right? If we can't tie this to a figure of the past, you know, we're not going to have this in our text, right? If there's a book that seems to contradict Torah, we're not going to have that in our text, right? And one example of that's why Ezekiel was actually debated by Jews, like in the first century probably, because and Ecclesiastes too, because it says things that seem to be at odds with things that Torah says, but eventually they made the cut, you know. So it's a historical process, very complicated. It's shrouded in mystery. Like there's an invisibility cloak really over the whole canonical process, I think. But it was something that I think was inevitable as Judaism, especially, at least in their homeland, it came to an end in the year 70, right, with the destruction of the temple and more scattering. And Christians, the earliest Christians, I mean, Paul being one of them, really expected Jesus to come back very, very soon. And as time went on and that didn't happen, you have to settle in for the long haul. And that means you need to sort of canonize things. You need to have a rule that you go by, and oral tradition won't cut it anymore. And I think that's had good kinds of after effects where people have remembered that God and the Bible are not the same thing. And it's had rather disastrous effects when people have confused those two. So you can't even debate or argue with the Bible or think through it. You just have to believe what it says plainly on the surface and that kind of stuff. And that's one of the downsides of the canonical process, I think, but an inevitable one.
Well, in your studies, did you find that the work of the Apocrypha or the heretical works hold some value in interpreting the Bible?
I think so, yeah. The apocryphal books, which means hidden, that's which is a joke because they're not hidden anywhere. Everybody reads them. I don't understand it, but the apocryphal books, and they're, depending who you talk to in history, they're not always the same, like 15 or 16. There's some fewer, some added, but they're essentially part of the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox Christian traditions. It's just the Protestants who don't like them. And the reason is because Protestants don't like Catholics or Orthodox people. So when they did their thing with Martin Luther and John Calvin, they more or less adopted the Old Testament that Jews already had, because the Jewish canon doesn't include those books either, because they're written in Greek. That's one of the reasons. And they're also a little bit late. They're getting too far away from the old days, so that they weren't included. But I think they're wonderful, and I think they give us context for understanding things in the Bible, and in the Protestant Bible, the Jewish Bible itself. They give us some background, and some of them are just really, uplifting, I think, books to read. And Ecclesiasticus and the Wisdom of Solomon are two wonderful books of the Apocrypha that didn't make the cut. So yeah, I think there's a lot of value in reading those. And I have undergraduate students, when they buy Bibles for their Bible class, I really encourage them to buy a Bible that includes the Apocrypha in it, because that almost helps bridge the gap between sort of the close of the Old Testament period, which ends, it's complicated, but not long after the exile and the return from exile. And then, you have the New Testament over here, bang, 400 or 500 years later. And, people get the impression that, lay people get the impression that, like, nothing much was happening. People were just waiting for Jesus to show up. But Judaism was vibrant and expansive. And in the Apocrypha, you get all these theological dialogues, some of which really are important even for understanding some things in the New Testament. So yeah, I can go on and on about the Apocrypha and how important that body of literature is.
Oh, cool. We actually have another student question, Dr.
Okay.
Enns. Who we got, Kendall?
All right. This question comes from Cameron, and Cameron is asking, what is your favorite book of the Bible?
I hate that question so much because it changes. It's sort of a tie in the Old Testament. I can't just do one. What kind of a question is it? I like Job and Ecclesiastes. Those are two of my Old Testament books because they stick it in the face of conventional ways of thinking in Israelite culture, and it sort of undermines things like, if you're suffering, there must be some sin in your life and God's punishing you. And Job says, I don't think so. And then God sides with Job at the end of the book. So God agrees with Job against what God says in places like Deuteronomy. I love that stuff because there's this vibrant engagement. It's a debate in the tradition. And Ecclesiastes is very similar. In the New Testament, I'd probably have to say, again, if I can just give two. One is John's letters, especially First John, because it's very mystical and rather contemplative, which has meant a lot to me in my adult years, sort of bypassing my left brain. I need to do that all the time and just sort of experience. And the things, First John, whatever, 4, no one has ever seen God. Good thing to remember, no one has ever seen God. But if we love one another, well, that's how you commune with God. It's not just an ethereal thing, it's how you treat the person right next to you. And that's I love that because it's a reminder to me. The other one is Mark. I love the Gospel of Mark because, the famous scene at the end of the Gospel of Mark where the centurion, right, the Roman soldier is at the foot of the cross and Jesus has just died. And the Roman centurion says, surely this man was the Son of God. That's part of Mark's theology, which I love, and that's this, that it is through the crucifixion that you see Jesus as the Son of God, which is a paradox. It doesn't make any sense. But that's one of Mark's main themes. The exalted one is the crucified one. And that challenges to me all sorts of power moves in the Christian faith where you're looking to exalt yourself over other people. But it's actually the paradox of the crucifixion is where you see the Lordness of Jesus. And that's why, Mark's the original ending to the Gospel of Mark doesn't really have a resurrection scene to it. It's not because he didn't believe it or something, at least I assume he doesn't, but it's because he ended with this crucifixion and the people were afraid. They were afraid to sort of do anything about it because it was such an odd idea that the Son of God will be crucified. So those are, I gave you 4. I'll charge you extra for that. You just wanted one, but I can't.
No, yeah, you wanted one.
Yeah.
We just got another question in, Dr. Enns, so we're going to try to get them involved as much as possible.
Sure, let's do
Go ahead,
that.
Kendall.
All right. This question comes from Dr. Witten, and she asks, speaking of the Apocrypha, how much do you think is lost in terms of the ability to fully understand what is happening around Jesus without knowledge of the Hasmonean dynasty?
Yeah, I think, I give, okay, here's what, I'm trying to remember a quote here from a New Testament scholar I read years ago, where he said, the train of the Old Testament went through a tunnel and it came out the other side. Okay, that's the New Testament side. I think he says the train of Revelation entered a tunnel, and when it came out the other side, it was clearly carrying a lot more luggage and a lot more baggage than when it went into the tunnel. And that tunnel is that intertestamental or Second Temple period, they call it. And I give my college students, I put a list of terms on the board or on a PowerPoint slide, whatever I do. Words like Satan, Pharisee, tax collector, and like 40 terms. And I say, what do all these have in common? And the answer is they're not in the Old Testament, but they're all over the New. And they're still Jewish. So what happened? Well, the answer to those questions is in the continuing development of Judaism in the centuries preceding the dawn of the Christian era, where Jews were thinking long and hard about what is God like? What does it mean to be Jewish? What does it mean to be a faithful Jew? How can you be a faithful Jew in the midst of a Greek empire, which is not very Jewish at all? I mean, they'll eat anything. right? And Jews have restrictions. They don't circumcise their males, right? Men have to be circumcised in Judaism. And that kind of that religious political powder keg that's developing over hundreds of years, it actually does help make sense, I think, of at least some aspects of the New Testament. You'd be really startled to read things that Jesus says and does, or read things that Paul says and does with that background in mind. John Dominic Crossan, a well-known New Testament scholar, wonderful guy, but he says something like, if you had never heard of Jesus of Nazareth, just never heard, but if you understood what we call the Second Temple or intertestamental period, if you understood the developments in Judaism within themselves where they're not getting along, and then enter the Roman world and the Greek world and the tensions there. If you've never heard of Jesus, but you understood those tensions and what they represented, and then you open up like the Gospel of Mark and start reading, it's not long before you're going to start flipping ahead and saying, I'm not sure who this Jesus is, but I wonder when he's going to die, because he's not going to live very long talking the way that he talks. To me, that is so, it just gives so much meat to this stuff. It's not just little sayings of Jesus. There is a social, political, and religious contentious context within which the New Testament takes place, which resulted in Jesus, being crucified along with many other people. But that's how this story, this is where that goes, right? So I think it's exceedingly important. Thank you for that question. That's one of my hobby horses.
A great question. Right there at the New Testament, Dr. Enns, the four Gospels, the way that they work together, complementary, supplementary, or have a little tension between each other. How do you work through reading that comparatively in your own interpretations and your understandings?
I sort of let them be what they are and try to understand the theology of the writers as best as I can, by what they've written. They tried it early in the church for, I don't know, about 100 years or so, bringing the four Gospels together and making one big one out of it. And it took a while for people to realize this isn't working, because things are out of order and Jesus says different things about the same thing and blah, 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 all kind of stuff. So the church, one of the good moves of the early centuries of the church is to say, well, no, it's the gospel according to Matthew, according to Mark. You let their voices stand, and even where they contradict themselves, we're watching, we're seeing the fruit of people, real people in antiquity, bearing witness to the Jesus faith of their communities and what that looked like. And we're seeing something in Matthew we don't see in Luke, and all the ones, they're different. They're different gospels. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are connected. Everybody sort of thinks that. John's like, whatever, off on his doing his thing.
Yeah.
But again, John has a different context. He's a different world that he's speaking to. And I hold them together by letting them be what they are, and not feeling like I have to come up with the one Jesus that makes sense of all of this diversity. Rather, I see it as an invitation. I say this somewhat cautiously, but I see it as an invitation that this is what communities of faith have always done and always have to do, which is to embrace that responsibility to say, who is Jesus for us here and now? Always engaging the tradition, never ignoring it, but also saying, but right now for us, who do we say Jesus is, right? And I think that's, in a way, that's the history of Christian thought. That's what people have been doing for 2,000 years.
Thank you.
We talk about the diversity and contradictions within the Bible, and there's like this talk about inerrancy in the Bible.
Yes.
You talk about how the Bible is inspired. So how do you explain an inspired Bible and an errant Bible?
Because I the analogy that I use elsewhere is inspiration and incarnation are like they're not the same thing, but it's almost like an analogy to help us understand, the mystery of Jesus, which is complicated. And I don't understand Jesus. I don't mind telling you, I don't get it, like what's ontologically, what in heaven's name is going on here. But at least the classic Christian affirmation is that fully God and fully human, right? Well, if you saw Jesus walking down the street, would you say, well, there goes the second person of the Trinity? Probably not. Say, there goes a Jew. Look at the skin. Look at what he's wearing. Look at the language he's speaking. Thoroughly and basically thoroughly human. Well, what makes Jesus divine? Great question. Well, the resurrection. No, if there's anything that doesn't, it's the resurrection, because people are raised from the dead. Gods aren't raised from the dead, right? So is it miracles? No, it's not miracles, because Moses did those, Elijah did those, empowered by God. So what makes Jesus, more than human? Well, people point to things like, forgiving people of sins that they didn't commit against Jesus, right? Okay, that's interesting. Now you got my attention. But the thing is that, Jesus is still Jesus, even though he's thoroughly part of the limitations of his human context. Did Jesus know French? I'm going to go with no, right? Did Jesus understand quantum physics? I'm going to go with no. Does God understand it? Yes. But does Jesus understand it? Jesus isn't omniscient. He wasn't. He admits that he's not, right? So I think that to me is a helpful analogy for thinking about the Bible. The Bible is on one level, a thoroughly limited book. It has limitations of the cultures in which it was written. They probably thought the earth was flat. Maybe Paul didn't, because he's part of the Greco-Roman world, and the Greeks figured that out in 500 BC. But the Old Testament, they didn't, and the expressions of Scripture bear witness to the limitations of human civilizations and human cultures. I actually don't think of that as errors. Again, I think of that as a demonstration of contextuality, if anything. But where do you find God in that? Well, that's another question. Is God involved in Scripture? Yeah, I don't know how, but I know the result of that. I mean, people are still reading the Bible and praying to God and communing with God through reading the Bible, and it's been a few thousand years, right? So I sort of put it together that way. In other words, Alec, another way of putting it is that, well, if you have an inerrant Bible, it's easy to sort of commune with God. But if you have an errant Bible, that's the bad way to do it. But I don't even recognize the validity of that distinction between error and non-error, because it's a thoroughly modern concept that simply it really can't account for the ancient contextual nature of these texts. If Genesis 1 is not science, for some people, well, that's an error, because we all know science is true, so it's got to be science or else it's an error. I said, no, that's you're imposing your own cultural moment onto these ancient texts, and it's not historical. And if it is historical, then it's wrong, but it's not historical, right? We're back to the genre question. It's what are they trying to do in that context, and what do we have the right to expect of these people as they're writing these things in that context?
Yeah, that's nice. We actually have another question, Dr. Enns.
Great.
Go ahead, Kendall.
All right. This question comes from Rebecca, and she asks, how do you think the Bible will be moving forward in a more technological society? Do you think our relationship to it will change?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I like that. I think it's been changing. I think with the advent of even like telescopes, right? I think we've been in the process. I think we've been in the process of working out that kind of question for a very long time, and I guess now we're living in quantum mechanics, which is bizarre, and the universe is not what it seems to be, right? So I think the Bible's role, I would like to think that we can sort of not turn the clock back, but realize that the the Bible is not there to give us scientific information, or even in large respects, historical information, even though history is a big part of the Bible. It's a place where we can transcend the heavy left brain culture that we live in and commune with God in a way that bypasses some of our intellectual limitations that we put on it. I'd like to think, and I think this has been happening in the modern world now for hundreds of years, I'd like to think that the more progress we make scientifically, for example, the more we'll realize that we can't make the Bible into a book that can agree with science, for example, or other kinds of philosophies. And that can lead some people to say, well, then I don't want anything to do with the Bible. But for other people like me, I'm one of them. It's like, well, no, that just tells me that that particular modernist way of looking at the world, which postmodernism has been critiquing for 100 years now, but that modernist way of looking, a purely, let's say, scientific evidentialist way of looking at reality, that's limited too. And God has to be bigger than these things. And the way you access God in that sense is not by pursuing the left brain agenda, but by allowing for intuition, allowing for contemplation, allowing for resolving yourself to the fact that you don't know. And you won't know. And there are some things you can't know, one of which is God. We can't know God the way we know everything else. And if we can, then God's not God, right? So I think it may have a backdoor benefit, I think, even to how we read the Bible and what we expect of it, and at the end of the day, how we even commune with God.
Yeah, that you're alluding to the viewers out there. I mean, you speak of certainty, a lot when you're writing in your podcast and stuff, and you're alluding there. But also that question that Rebecca just asked. Last week's guest, we had Gregory Ulmer, who says we may be moving out of an era of literacy into something else, something that is. So what is the Bible, which is literate? What will it become in this new era? But
well, it may be something that pushes us beyond the words on the page, so to speak, right? So, I mean, again, this is just the way I think about it. I can't prove any of this stuff, but I think the purpose of the Bible is to point beyond or outside of itself. It's not to keep looking with the magnifying glass. It's trying to envision a reality that the ancient writers were trying to present in their own cultural context. And we have the responsibility to do that for our context, which is a context that the biblical writers never remotely imagined or dreamed of. Right. So we have to keep the process going, which I think started within the Bible itself, which is the Bible looks beyond itself. The writers, at the end of the day, when you canonize this stuff, I think one thing good that happened is that this is something that is a means of grace, so to speak. It's a means of communion with God, which means the goal is always outside of the text, not the text itself.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Well, also, Dr. Enns, you're talking to some English graduate students, English department, 21st century ones. We like the symbolism. We like allegory. If it isn't there, we feel unsatisfied with the text.
Right, yeah. Well, read the Bible, folks. It's there. So.
Well, I was going to ask you, do you have an example that maybe is not well known, or one that is your favorite, where that or was illuminating when you first came across it that you can share with us?
Like an allegorical meaning, or like a non-literal
meaning?
Yeah,
an allegorical or symbol. Yes. Yeah, not to, we are in the fundamentalist South down here, but we'll have a little fun with it if you know.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, I think, briefly, and I alluded to this earlier, and if this is something you've heard before, then forgive me, but it's the realization that the Adam and Eve story really represents Israel's journey. It is almost an allegory for the journey of Israel. What I mean is that Adam was created by God out of dust. He was then placed into a paradise, the Garden of Eden. And he was given a stipulation: if you obey, you stay. If you disobey, you will die. Now, here's what happens when he disobeys. At the end of that story, he doesn't die, but he's cast out of the garden. He's exiled, if you will, right? So this is an ancient Jewish, I didn't make this up, but the analogy is that, well, Israel was created by God out of the slavery of Egypt and then placed into the promised land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And there were stipulations given: if you obey, you stay. If you disobey, you will be exiled. And exile is also referred to as a form of death in the Old Testament. So the analogy there is very clear to me, and it's not the only way of reading the story, but it's a very important one where, Adam is not the first person. Adam represents Israel's entire journey. Genesis 2 and 3 is almost a table of contents for what's going to happen with the Israelites afterwards, so I could go on and on about that. I don't want to, but respectful of your time.
We appreciate that nugget.
Yeah. So go tell that in your churches in the South and see what happens, and just email me, and don't say I didn't blame you. So I didn't warn you. So
a link to your website. That's what we'll do when we send the email.
All right. Speaking of your website, yes. Are you currently working on anything new?
Yeah, actually, I sort of am. I've been thinking about it for a year and reading and taking notes and stuff, and I am going to have trouble explaining it. But the working title is God and Curveballs, and here's the point: our experiences throw us curveballs all the time, and in terms of how we think about life and how we think about God. And like a good baseball player, forgive the homey analogy, but you have to adjust to a curveball. You can't just keep swinging at it. You have to make adjustments to the reality of the game in order to be successful. And I think the curveballs that are thrown at us are the same ones that everybody's had, like people die, or I don't know how to raise my children, or, I lost my job, or there are horrible things happening in the world. And then add to that, like the question that was asked before about science, scientific realities are throwing curveballs at older theological systems, right? So I'm going to try to bring those things together along with the Bible, believe it or not, those places where the Bible encourages what people call non-dualistic thinking. It not either or, yes or no, right or wrong, but that open up basically a dimension of mystery in the Christian faith where we actually don't know where this is going to go. And it's okay not to have the answer to all these things that are sort of curveballs thrown at us. That's just part of life. And the Christian faith can handle it if we don't reduce it to a simple set of rules, which is always the temptation.
Oh, wonderful. Well, that's it for us, Dr. Enns, and we'll be looking out for that. Sounds like you got a little work to do on it, but
I do.
Yeah.
I do.
And so curveballs, we see that New York Yankees.
I know. That's not on purpose. That's where it is, and this is where my camera is. So I apologize to all you non-Yankee fans down there.
Yeah.
So
we don't have a baseball team in Louisiana. They're mostly either Astros fans or Braves fans. That's as far as.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
But y'all, that was Dr. Enns, and this is the Iconocast with Southeastern Louisiana University's English Department's Colloquium. Dr. Enns, let me tell y'all about him a little bit more. He's Abram S. Clemens Professor of Biblical Studies at Eastern University right now. He's also the host of an outstanding podcast called The Bible for Normal People. It's left me and Alec with our jaw dropped a few times. A bunch of that symbolism, allegory, investigative, and other guests coming on, you can really, really get it there to plug that in. But his books are also really great. We usually keep a copy here, but they have on Kindle for a good price right now. So y'all run over there to get it. And it'll still be literacy. It's just on a different thing. But that was Dr. Enns, and that's he is our final guest for this semester. Y'all check out the website, social media. We'll be back rolling in the summer, and to into the fall. This is Alec, Tyler. We want to thank Caleb and Kendall on the team, and especially Dr. David Hanson, the department head, for making this happen. And we'll see you guys later. Thank y'all.
Thank you.